In this class we're going to talk about SMART objectives, talk about the meaning of this anagram, what each of the letters means, and why it's important to have this ideal of having SMART objectives. So first of all, we're dealing here with essentially marketing objectives. Now, objectives are important and need to be developed by organizations. The purpose of objectives is to provide direction. Without objectives, the organization will be drifting. It will perhaps be inconsistent in its decision making. It will contradict itself. It will waste energy and resources in developing certain lines of thought and acting in certain ways, and then later changing it because it'll find that the ways in which it was planning were not appropriate or were inefficient or were leading to a dead end. So it's important to have well thought out objectives right at the start. The SMART is a framework, I should say, used by management to help develop objectives within their own area of responsibility. So although we can imagine the SMART objectives applied to the organization in total, it could also be applied to problem solving within particular departments. It can be applied on a macro level in the sense of the organization in total, or it could be applied in a micro sense within departments or related to specific tasks or functions. SMART framework ensures that objectives are valid and can be monitored, measured and assessed against progress. So it's important to be able to set up objectives which can be measured and monitored and checked and so on. It's important that this should be subjected to scrutiny and to evaluation, and that they're well thought out right from the start, with the purpose of ensuring that when they are established, when processes are established, that they can be monitored, they can be checked, they do align with the objectives of the organization or the objectives that are set for that particular task. So it's important that the whole SMART framework is borne in mind right from inception, right from the start of the project, right through to its end. So to develop an organization's strategic direction, that's the idea. Develop the organization's strategic direction and do it consistently, do it logically, and ensure that it meets certain minimum standards and requirements. It should also motivate staff and teams to reach a set goal, because once contributors towards an objective understand what is required and how it will be measured and assessed and monitored and so on, then they know about how to go about the goal more precisely. They know what's expected at the end. So that should drive the way in which they go about the objectives from the start, how they set it up from the start. It's necessary to provide consistency and efficiency within all functions of the organization. It does provide consistency and efficiency because it is a framework, and in a sense the boxes have to be ticked. The SMART boxes have to be ticked. Each of the requirements of the SMART program must be understood and must be factored in right from the start. So we'll start. The first letter we encounter in this anagram is S. S for specific. The objectives should be clear and specify what the organization wants to achieve. There should be specific objectives. If they're generalized objectives, the organization is going to lose sight of what's required. It's going to drift. There's going to be contradictions built in and inconsistencies. It's important that the organization have specific objectives that need to be met. These are identified and are met right from the start. Next, measurable. The objectives should be measurable, should be capable of measurement, so as to determine their success. Ideally, objectives should be measured. They should be gauged in some way as having met the objectives or not met the objectives. But there's no way in which we can tell if a particular course of action is successful unless we can measure its success. We may evaluate it subjectively, but it's much more preferable to be able to measure it objectively, if possible. The objectives should be achievable. It's pointless setting objectives that can't be achieved. No one's going to even try. They must see the objectives as achievable. So the personnel who are working on this particular task must understand that the task can be done. It is achievable. It may be difficult, but it's achievable. If they see the task as impossible, they're not going to be motivated. In fact, they're not going to even engage with the process because there was no point. So objectives should be achievable. And they should be realistic. Does the organisation have enough resources and capabilities to accomplish the objectives? Realistic in the sense that they may be achievable, but simply that particular organisation can't do it because it doesn't have the resources, it doesn't have the skills, it doesn't have the facilities to attempt that particular project. The project is achievable, but it's only achievable if the right resources are in place and the right amounts of resources are in place. And the organisation may not have that. So the objectives should be realistic, given the resource envelope of the organisation. It should be realistic. And time. A deadline should be set to achieve the objectives. If there's no deadline, there's no urgency, and it may drift on for a very long period of time. In fact, it may never be completed because it wasn't seen as urgent or as important. So a time must be set on the achievement of the objectives. So now we've got the 5 SMART objectives. Objectives should be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and what we call time-bound. There should be a time deadline at the end. And these are the SMART objectives. These are the criteria that should be borne in mind when setting up objectives. Let's look at a couple of very straightforward examples just to illustrate this. Let's say to custom build a database of at least 30,000 households within the next 2 years. Let's say the marketing section of a business wants to build a database with at least 300,000 households. They want to have details from at least 300,000 households within the next 2 years. Now we want to measure this in terms of the SMART objectives. We want to see if that's reasonable. So let's go through the SMART objectives and look at this. The marketing section wants perhaps names and addresses from 300,000 houses, and perhaps email addresses, perhaps telephone numbers, and so on. Is it realistic? Well, first of all, is it specific? Well, yes, it is very specific. They're stating they need 300,000 in 2 years. That's specific. So there's no doubt about what they want. It's absolutely specific. It's measurable. They want 300,000. They don't want 290,000 or 350,000. They want 300,000. It's measurable. So it's possible to measure the extent to which this objective has been achieved or not. And is it achievable? Well, it depends on the resources. So it depends on whether the marketing department, let's say, has got enough resources to build this database. Is it realistic? Again, it depends on the resources. The organisation may not be able to afford this. It may want something less. It'll have to be discussed at management level and to see if it is a realistic objective. It might be too ambitious. But it's achievable. Yeah, it's achievable if the resources are there. It can be done. We can conceive of this happening. Is it realistic? Well, if the resources, but perhaps the resources could be better used elsewhere, for example. Time, yes, 2 years. So now we can see the extent to which this objective, building a database of at least 300,000 households in 2 years, we can see it in terms of the SMART objectives. And you can see it certainly meets 3 out of the 5. Items 3 and 4, well, there depends on the resources. Another SMART objective could be to achieve a market share of 20% by the end of the year. Is that a SMART objective? You can work through it yourself. We want to achieve a 5% customer brand awareness by the next quarter. Is that measurable, for example? The measurability might be a problem. What do we mean by brand awareness, and how do we measure the customers? Reduce the carbon footprint by 10% within 2 years. Is that SMART? Is it measurable? Well, sounds like it. Reduce the carbon footprint 2 years. Is it specific? Seems to be 10% within 2 years. Is it realistic? Well, it depends on available technologies and what other technologies can be deployed. So it's possible to go through the SMART objectives and try to measure every statement we make in the context of this particular framework. So that's a brief outline of what we mean by SMART objectives, worth bearing in mind. In the meantime, that's all we're going to deal with here, so thank you for watching.